with step increases. That has nothing to do with pay enhancements. That's the normal advancement process. A lot of the pay enhancements, the 6% or 4% for an education degree, the sewing allowance, the special teams allowances, a lot of those things that we've been doing as percentages, the idea is that those would be wrapped up either into classes or titles. And move forward again based on the qualifications. Later on the page, management rights. This is carried over from the definitions, the strengthening on scheduling and supervision. Going to page 8, Employee Relations Board. There were some changes here. Substantively, I don't think anything has really changed. This section was considerably out of date when it was put in place. There was anticipation of a very active, almost professional Employee Relations Board with a lot of staffing. And as a practical matter, that's not what has taken place. So it's been consolidated, one, to make it consistent with how we treat other boards. And secondly, to just clarify, it'll continue in its current jobs as it has been doing on dealing with unfair labor practices, classification disputes as to whether to be in a bargaining unit or not, and appointing a neutral in the impasse resolution procedures, which we'll discuss later. Going on to page 10, collective bargaining units, section 60. Again, we've strengthened the supervisory and the confidential employees language. This is a new age. When this was last done in 1989, IT was spread out throughout the municipality because we were using green screens, and a lot of people were still using carbon paper. Now IT is an integrated function, handled centrally, and the move is to have IT people supervised by people who understand what they're doing, understand IT, and not directing another department that has really nothing to do with other than using the IT services. Certification of bargaining representative. We did just a tiny bit of housekeeping in here. That was on page 13 and 14. And that's just on petitions that we put a time limit of 180 days for collection. Moving on to page 15, section 90, collective bargaining. Hot issue is section A2, and that's the signatory language. It's come up in regard to one of our contracts, and it's been a large issue, and I think the Assembly members are aware of that. Section B, we just clarified a little bit on the reporting. Section D, D3B, and this is where we get into a little bit more of the transparency and this direct cost limitation. The direct labor costs are to be compared on a 3-year projection for revenue. And again, this is not an absolute hard cap, but when a labor contract comes before this body, the Assembly, you're going to be provided the information. You know what that contract costs, and you know where our revenue is going, and you can make educated decisions on what to do with that. Moving on to page 17, I know a lot of people want to hear a lot about this, and we'll get more in depth on the mediation, fact-finding, and ultimate impasse resolution procedures. In mediation, the change is that it'll be a 50-50 split of the mediator's costs, having both sides invested in the mediation process. It's a small change, but hopefully it helps bring the parties closer together, because ultimately what we're trying to achieve is a voluntary contract and not something enforced by a third party, be it the assembly or anyone else. We've cleaned up the fact-finding procedure a little bit to make it a little bit more clear as to the timing of the process. And in section C, that's on the bottom of page 17, what we've noted is the parties can continue negotiating, but only for up to 150 days by mutual consent. This is to avoid these negotiations that go on for a year, 2 years, 3 years. We get way down the road and have a big mess to unravel, just continuing the old contract. We already have to start at least 90 days advance of expiration. You know, it may take more time, it often does, but another half year should be more than enough. And that fits together with the next section on impasse resolutions. And again, I'll get back to this, but rather than going to arbitration at that stage, what is proposed in the amended ordinance is that after mediation, after fact-finding, if the parties just can't get it together, the last best offers would go to you, the assembly, and you choose one or the other. You know, there'll be some room probably to advise people you better get together and come to an agreement or we're going to impose something on you. But at the end of the day, you, the assembly, will say, this is the agreement, this is what I'm agreeing to. You're not going to have forced on you from some arbitrator. After that section, most of this section is deleted because, again, we're not going through the arbitration proceedings, and that takes us to page 22, section 120. And it prohibits strikes, and we'll speak more about this later, but the idea is to get labor relations not into a threat of shutting down public services. In fact, economic blackmail, as some people have termed it, but either way, get it back to we either get a voluntary agreement by everybody or our elected representatives are making the decision. Page 23, section 130, agreements. Just a little bit of added language here that basically comes off of what has been the advice of the assembly in the past, and also to get out of, at times, what is called past practice, when we're going back to letters of agreement that are long gone and should not be part of the contract. We're now adding in terms to contracts a number of years later. Unfair labor practices has not changed in any significant way. The hearing process, we've changed 2 weeks to 14 days. That takes us up to page 27. And I want to highlight section 150, which is the dues checkoff. This section was not changed one bit. This ordinance is not out as they've done in Michigan and Wisconsin, where they've said, maybe we won't outlaw the unions, but we'll take away their dues, we'll take away any participation they have in the process. This ordinance recognizes that we've had a long history of collective bargaining here in Anchorage, and it's going to continue. Moving on, 37160, binding arbitration. And this has to deal with the binding arbitration we go into in discipline cases and in contract disputes. It's called grievance arbitration. And what has been added in here is just a provision regarding past practices and whether they can be considered by the arbitrator and under what circumstances. And where this comes in is past practice is a very ill-defined term, and quite frankly, I'm not sure if we can fully define it in a way that arbitrators aren't going to find some way around it, but we're at least trying. And that is, the arbitrator can look to past practice if there is an ambiguous term in the contract, something that they don't know, the parties don't know how it should be dealt with, the language isn't clear. However, it keeps arbitrators from putting in terms to a contract that don't exist. Simply because in the past, management gave everyone a turkey on Thanksgiving doesn't mean management has to continue it unless it's part of the contract. It doesn't become part of the contract because management has allowed it. And where that is important is here in the municipality, especially with as many contracts as we have, is over the years, numerous times we have provisions, usually in regard to leave or payroll, that are implemented by payroll clerks who may or may not be in the bargaining unit or may or may not be paying attention. But we find out 5 years later when we follow the language of the contract that we've been doing something completely different, and the arbitrator says you're stuck with it. It keeps the arbitrator from contradicting the explicit terms of the contract. We had an arbitration a few years ago where the contract said 3 or 8 visits. What the arbitrator said is, well, you've been going 8 or 10 years with 8 visits, you can't do 3 visits. That's an express contract that the arbitrator overrode. Moving on to page 28, section 170, applicability of personnel regulations. This has been beefed up a little bit. This is not like it was in the 1980s when it was put in the personnel regulations rule, period. There can be variations from the personnel regulations, but it's something that has to be presented to you, the assembly. It's not hidden in the contract, it's not hidden in the memorandum of agreement. It is something that's put in front of the assembly to say, we are not going to follow the personnel regulations here, and presumably an explanation will be provided at that time. But there has to be a conscious decision to vary from the personnel regulations. Second paragraph, uniform FLSA, that's the Federal Fair Labor Standards Act, which is what we are governed by for overtime and a number of other provisions. And this is, again, to standardize between the personnel rules and FLSA to have consistent overtime, travel time, jury time. Because on several of those, we have 25 different definitions for overtime in this municipality right now. It's almost impossible to figure out sometimes. Each contract may have a different view of how to handle jury leave or different medical leaves. And we need to standardize this. Moving on, the last section is on page 29, 37190. 2 points here. One, we caught an error. This was at the very end of the ordinance. That section, the language there, should be underlined, and actually we're going to amend it. This is not what it was meant to say, and or this will propose an amendment to fix that. And I'd also point out that most of 37190 is the Exhibit A to the ordinance. It's 13 pages that have been deleted.
You're talking about the EMS, you're talking about Sec 37185A that you're putting back?
Oh, sorry.
37190.
Which one? 190.
I was talking about 90. I had accidentally skipped over 185.
Oh, okay.
I'll go back to 185 in a second. Have not come up with the language. There was a change today, but 185, we will be recognizing this agreement. That was originally deleted because the agreement's been enforced. Why is it in the ordinance? This was housekeeping for moving forward, but it's my understanding we're gonna codify that. There'll be an amendment proposed. Moving on to 190. 190 laid out 5 bargaining units. We currently have 9. Within each bargaining unit, it said these classifications are in the bargaining unit. That was back in '89. Most of those classifications have gone through several title changes, numerous duty changes. And the entire section was deleted. It wasn't spelled out what our current bargaining units are because that may change. This is the 10,000 foot level, 370 is. It allows for new bargaining units to come in. It allows for old bargaining units to leave. It allows for classifications to move from one bargaining unit to another, or in and out of bargaining units. It's a flexible document that needs to go on forever, and for that reason, the codification of personnel as to what bargaining units exist and who's in that is handled by the CBAs, handled by the classification system, and handled by the Employee Relations Board. And I think we had a little bit of drill down on a couple of the big sections now.
Are we ready to this?
Sure.
We're going to walk through now the kind of the main points and give a little bit more description of what the thinking was, why the changes are necessary, some of the precedents that have been set in other jurisdictions that we rely on to use for examples on where it works in other places, or in some cases, why the courts have ruled the way they have and what they've ruled.